So today I thought we'll talk about an idea that I have called the relational school to provide a bit of a framework around trauma-informed practice in education. Whether you're a clinician, a doctor, a teacher, reading this or listening to this, you can definitely see things from various perspectives, and hopefully this will be something that's helpful. Okay, so what's the current state? What's the current problem that we notice? And the current issue that we see is that most schools treat behaviour as the problem. And as we've said many times before, that that behaviours are communication. All behaviour is communication. All behaviour is a clue that the child is telling us about them not coping or that they're overwhelmed. And that's not just about children, it's about human beings. And our traditional approach is a behaviour, there's a consequence, but what tends to happen is there's an escalation that can happen in those attempts to manage or support those behaviours. And what then happens is the child then gets told to go home. The parent gets called, come and pick your child up. And even last week, you'd think that things have progressed a bit in terms of trauma-informed thinking or developmentally informed thinking, but even last week I had to communicate with the school about a comment from the school that says the child cannot come back until they have medication, or the child cannot come back until there is clearance, psychological clearance. Then that's the question, right? So then what happens is this is relationship breakdown. Right? Then the child loses faith in the school. The child loses faith in the teachers, and then unfortunately the cycle just repeats, and that's a common thing. Who else sees that? Right? Do we all agree that that's a fairly common issue? Yeah. So definitely worth talking about. Let's jump back into the brain, right, and think about what it means. So what we know is that connection is a precondition for learning, right? So we've talked, just a quick refresher, that there's a balance that we need to hit between our survival brain, our fight, flight, freeze responses, and our thinking brain, our logical brain. And we need to realize that when we feel under threat, our survival brain kicks in and switches off our logical or rational brain. We know that our prefrontal cortex disappears and goes offline when we feel under threat. And what happens when our frontal lobe switches off? Well, it means that we can't learn, and it means we can't think. So the overall strategy has to be that we need to regulate first before we reflect, and definitely regulate first before we teach or ask questions like, how could we have done that better? Or what could we have done differently? There's lots of evidence around this. Dan Siegel, Dan Hughes talks about this, and as we've talked about last week, or in a fortnight ago, that different types of exposure to adversity causes different or distinct neurobiological profiles. So what that means is that different types of abuse, remember, so the number of adverse childhood experiences can create a different type of brain. And so it really does highlight that one size does really not fit all. And that this is part of the problem, is that school systems need to create standardized approaches, behavioral support plans, and when your brain's not typical, it's not going to work. And unfortunately, we blame the child for that instead of our approach. What does the evidence say? So that there's plenty of studies, right, that talk about how improved or the quality of the teacher-student relationship predicts academic outcomes. Right? And we know that that's been a repeatable thing. We also know that attachment-aware schools. So that's a UK study called the Attachment-Aware Schools Project, where 99% of teachers reported that being more attachment-aware led to positive behavioural impact. Okay, so there's already evidence about this, and then you've got this evidence that improved self-regulation, right, from the teacher during high stress interactions improves. Right? So that when you are more attachment aware, when your approach is more about understanding the child and where they're coming from and their neurobiology, the teacher is more able to regulate their system better. And what that means is that there's less burnout. Right? Because when there's less conflictual relationships, and there's systems built around understanding the child, the teacher doesn't get kicked in the legs, and the teacher doesn't get hurt. And that's what we see. That's what we see all the time, is that teachers who are well-meaning and want to help the child, the system isn't there, the framework isn't there for them, because the traditional ways that they've been taught doesn't work. It actually leads to worsening the problem in the child with the wrong or the different neurotype. So what happens then? We have teacher turnover, which again causes destabilization of the relational environment, which repeats that cycle again, where children struggle, and the cycle repeats. So what do we actually need to do, right? And so this is kind of a bit of a wish, right, at the moment, which is a bit sad that this is not something that we can I don't know a school that confidently implements this approach. What we see is that we've got some schools that are lucky enough to have particular champions, right? Particular champions where you might have a teacher who's trauma informed and relationally informed and understands the needs of children, and so then what they have is that they work really hard, but often that teacher can burn out because there needs to be a framework. And at the bottom of this cake or these tiers, that there has to be leadership alignment. Right, that the school leaders need to have a trauma-informed and developmentally informed understanding of why children misbehave or why children's behaviors or emotions become difficult in the classroom. And before they ask anything of the classroom teachers, or before they ask the teachers to implement things, they need to have the attitude. Right? And there needs to be alignment around how do we understand children's relational styles, how do we understand children's emotional development, and what is the likely outcome of the interventions that you've got in place. That it has to start from there, right? Because then you need to have this staff capacity and shared language around what they should be doing, right? How should we approach this? Because often the approaches aren't working. The current things that we're doing isn't working, so we need to do something different. And then for about, I would even say probably less than 5% of the kids who have problems at school will need clinical consultation, right? Will need assessment or diagnoses or psychiatric input. And I would say that most of them would probably benefit from parent work, but even that, you can probably narrow it down to a small number that will actually need that level of complexity and intervention, because if you have the right philosophy and the right approach, you won't need that higher level. And for the clinicians, that's where we sit, right? Is in that higher level. And I would like to think that we would have a role, particularly in our 0 to 11 service, to be able to influence schools and how we approach children at those lower tiers, instead of waiting for a referral for an 8-year-old because the emotions are too difficult to contain. Now, if anyone who's listening to this live, or anyone in the Teams meeting, we can't see your the chat, or we can't see your call, so you'll have to just speak up if you have any thoughts. So feel free to interrupt me. Let's now think about a bit of an approach, right? So as you know, my training is in dyadic developmental psychotherapy, and you would all have heard about this concept of PACE, which I think is it's been said in multiple settings, but PACE really stands as a very helpful relational stance, right? And PACE, as an acronym, stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And for those who haven't heard me talk about it, there's other places where I've talked about this before. But in a summary, playfulness is about keeping the energy light, right? Having a light tone and keeping the energy as playful as possible keeps the nervous system more integrated, more connected. It's harder to be defensive when you are in a playful environment, right? The really strong impact of playfulness is it reduces shame. So those of you who've seen kids dysregulate in a classroom, shame is something that we miss a lot. But I can almost guarantee you that shame is the thing that pushes that child over the edge, right? And sometimes because of their history, shame kicks in really quickly and you don't get a chance you don't see a ramp into shame. So often they carry shame with them all the time. And shame can be triggered by a teacher looking at a child with anger in their eyes or disappointment in their eyes. So what does that mean? It means that if you have an emotional system, if you have a relational style or an attachment style where you already know, it's not a think, you already know that you're not good enough. You already know that you're a disappointment to your parents and your family. You already know that you're a bad child. That is what pushes people into shame, and that shame is the thing that pushes people into overwhelm. And when I say overwhelm, I mean to the level where they're going to upturn a table. Like those kids who are smashing windows, right? You'll see the kids who are trying to elicit a response. There'll be little taps on a window, or there'll be these kind of provocative, hyperactive behaviors, and you go, okay, I think you're trying to tell me something. But the kids who've gone into shame, they will kick you. They will throw it at you. Everything will be upturned. That's what it is. And you see that in a teenager. Right? You'll see that in an adult. The adults who will jump in the car, driving while they're drunk because they've lost control of their decision making. That shame is going to be one of the biggest triggers for that. Right? And shame is the biggest relational trigger. Right? And if we even think about it ourselves, if we've ever, someone who we really care about, our partner or our parent, when you get into this mode where you're like, they're so disappointed in me, you lose control. Yeah, so look, it's a really important concept to think about. And this is the power of playfulness, right? Is that it reduces the chance of them tipping into that shame, that shame realm, which maintains their capacity to maintain logical thinking, right? To keep them integrated enough. They'll still be dysregulated, but they probably won't kick you in the shins, right? And they might be able to respond. So, a practical example that is that there was a child who was dysregulating in the classroom. The assistant principal had walked in and said, "Come on, mate, let's go outside and we'll go have some time out, and I'll spend some time with you in the playground." And it wasn't until that child was actually starting to come out of the classroom to follow the assistant principal, but they accidentally stepped on on an ottoman or a cushion, and that pushed the classroom teacher just a little bit further. And the classroom teacher said, why would you step on that? And that simple comment was enough, and everything exploded, right? And that's a really clear demarcation when that child was able to still engage in this person who was trying to connect with them, and then something else happened that pushed them into that realm, and then they could no longer do that anymore. So then what you do at that point is you then have to wait for that volcano to stop erupting before you can go back and try again. Happens every time. Right? And remember that all dysregulation peaks, all volcanoes will burn out and then come back. And you just, we work really hard not to have that lava sprouting all over us. But when it does, you have to just hold on. And that's really important to remember too. So playfulness is really, really, it's hard to do because it's, you obviously don't want to be, taking the piss, right? And you also don't want to be minimizing the situation, but it's important that you remain regulated so you can keep the energy light. Acceptance is about accepting the feeling whilst holding the boundary on behaviors, right? I'm not going to let you hurt me, but I can see that you're really frustrated and angry at me, right? And it's okay to get angry with me, but it's not okay but I won't let you throw the chair at me. Let me help you cope with that. Or let me help you with that anger. Oh, and if that's too reflective, then you can stay in. Are you really angry with me because I said no, or are you really angry with me because I wouldn't let you open that packet of texters, or are you angry with me because I told you to stop what you were doing? The obvious thing, right? And that when you are accepting of a child's emotional state, and you respond with curiosity instead of why did you do that, you say, oh, I wonder how you're feeling right now. I wonder what happened for you. Curiosity is the antidote to shame. It replaces blame. Curiosity says, I actually want to understand what's happening for you right now. Right? And if the child's too young to have that language, then you stay in acceptance. You can only stay in acceptance. You're really angry with me. It's okay to get angry with me. Right? Let me help you with that. I'm going to help you feel better. Because, and so if you can't, because obviously with things are escalating, you try and remain in a light tone, which means, remain keeping your voice in that storytelling tone rather than an angry tone. And most of the time, when things are dysregulated, then you can only stay in acceptance and empathy. Right? Because some kids aren't ready for curiosity even. Some kids aren't even ready for empathy. Right? Which is, that acknowledge, oh, I can see now why you're so angry with me. You really wanted to do that, and I didn't let you. But the purpose, the beauty of this approach is this is the practical way of, when people say connection before correction, well, what does connection mean? This is what connection means. This is staying in acceptance and empathy. It's connection before correction is not a philosophical preference. Right? It's a necessity. It's a neurobiological necessity. You can't do anything without connection unless you want to make it worse. Now, so as an approach, right, PACE is very, very helpful. It's very easy to remember. Difficult to practice. And it's important to keep practicing it. But if we think about, but then what we can do is also think about, well, let's gather some more evidence. Let's talk about some more evidence. Let's talk about more approaches to, maybe a clinical approach to this issue, right? And we'll hold PACE in our minds. So what does it mean, right? Do you know that there are some tools that you can use or that you can call on? So there is a thing called the STRS, the Student-Teacher Relationship Scale, right? That measures a number of things: closeness, conflict, dependency. It measures, and it is a self-report from the teacher, right? So it's not a personality test for the child. It's a measure of how the teacher sees the relationship, right? And look, there's obviously going to be limitations in subjective reports. However, it's a tool that can give a school something that they don't have very often, which is quantifiable relational data, something that you can actually use to measure, right? And it's been, it's been really assessed, and the integrity of it, and it's been used in multiple studies, and applying it to an assessment of the child's relational style, or the relationship between the child and the parent and the teacher, will help you come up with answers, will help you understand. And it's often it can actually be a really helpful way for a teacher who's feeling stuck, right? Because it measures, well, how open are they to warmth and open communication? Will the student use the teacher as a secure base, right? And if the child doesn't, if the closeness score is low, then it means that trust isn't there. So that child might not be ready for curiosity. That child may not necessarily trust your playfulness, right? And so you need to be ready that you need to help that child feel accepted and understood. Okay, and if you've got, and if you identify high conflict, there's a struggle, it's unpredictable, there's negativity in the relationship, and this conflict score is a really high it has been shown to be predictive of teacher burnout, and has been shown to be a predictor of that child being asked not to come back to school. All right, which means you then need to think about structure. How can you send a playful and safe message to that child from the moment they enter the gates? Right? That's the level of intervention. That's the level of early intervention of thought that you need to have. And then if you've got dependency where the child is anxious and constantly relying on constant reassurance, it means that there's going to be a need for that child to have a more structured approach. Right? And so then what you can do with this is you can track this assessment longitudinally. You can, where you're trying to aim for it, increasing the closeness score and reducing those conflict scores. And then the dependency scores, I would guess, would take time, right? Because that's really a marker of the child's trust system. Okay, so the reason why I'm bringing this up is that there are ways that you can, as clinicians and even as teachers, to go, look, there are validated ways that you can assess this. That that gives the schools, the clinicians, the families a shared language. Right? But this is at that level. This is at that teacher level. Remember, right? And if the leadership or the philosophy of the school isn't inclusive of this, then it's not an option. And often, I'm not sure I've ever heard a teacher talk about assessing the student-teacher relationship in a kind of structured way. There are some limitations, such as that it's a self-report from the teacher. It depends a bit on the teacher's philosophy and the teacher's attitude towards trauma-informed education. It obviously dependent a lot on the philosophy of the school and the attitude of the school and its leadership. And one of the ways we can try to address that is this thing called the teacher relationship interview. So what this does is, and this is a bit more, this needs to be kind of addressed with a bit more care, and perhaps someone who's supporting a teacher, right? It might be a clinician who's supporting a teacher, where what you're doing is it addresses what the STRS doesn't, which is about the teacher's own internal working model of the child, right? Now, so think about that. The level of relationship and connection you need to have with that teacher for that teacher to feel safe enough to have this to even have this conversation with somebody without feeling blamed or assessed themselves, right? But it's very important that we all just acknowledge that every adult brings their own relational history into the classroom. Just like as a therapist or a doctor, you bring your own you bring your own baggage, right, for lack of a better phrase. Sometimes our baggage is actually quite nice and light, and we actually don't mind carrying it. But some of our baggage is really, really terrible and really painful and hurts our back. And what it does is that, when a child's behavior activates a teacher's defensive response, so the teacher might be getting frustrated, the teacher might want to withdraw, the teacher might need to control situations too much, or the teacher might actually feel helpless. Right? So remember, attachment is a one-way street. Right? And emotional safety between adults and children is a one-way street. That child who hasn't yet learned or developed the brain systems that help them to regulate is going to be dependent on that adult. So in dialectic development psychotherapy, we talk about this situation as what's called blocked care. Right? And the symptoms of blocked care as a parent, but also applies as a child, as a teacher, is number one, you don't want to be near the child. You don't look forward to walking to the classroom because that child's there. You are walking on eggshells, right? You no longer feel pleasure around the child. When you look at kids and you're going, oh, that's so cute. I'm really wondering what's going on in their mind. Right? Children give you joy. You experience joy when you're watching children. But there are children you go, oh, I'm not wondering what's going on in their mind. In fact, you actually have a negative narrative in your mind about them. They're so annoying. They deliberately annoy. Which why I don't like diagnoses like oppositional defiant disorder. Because it says that. They're deliberately annoying. As if it's a choice. And that's a sign that so what does this mean? If you're a carer or a teacher or a parent who is experiencing blocked care, it means that your own emotional system is kicking in to protect you. You're there for the right reasons. You care about kids. You love your child, but your emotional system won't let you. Right? Sometimes it's because of your own experience, your childhood experience, but often it's because on top of your own childhood experience, the experience that you've had with the child has actually hurt you. And you're genuinely scared of the child. I don't want to be kicked at again. I don't like that. And it might trigger things in you, in your current relationships or your previous relationships. And that's what causes blocked care, because your brain is kicking in. So, and how do we address that? We address that with self-compassion. You have to. And so that's what I love about something like the TRI, is that it provides a structured reflective process, right? Look, a teacher can definitely do this on their own, but look, whilst it's not therapy, it doesn't need to be done with a therapist, but it needs to be done in an accepting environment where you feel emotionally safe to reflect on your own responses. So focusing on your feelings. What's my body telling me when this child walks in the room? What are my impulses? So like that teacher that pushed that child over the edge, actually came back to the assistant principal later going, I'm so sorry, I don't know why I did that. I knew. I knew that was going to lead to something, that was going to make it worse. But my brain couldn't stop. It just did it. And that's a sign of blocked care. And if a school doesn't notice that as a sign of blocked care, that teacher needs more support, that teacher needs more self-compassion, that teacher needs more time and people around them to recharge their emotional batteries, it's just going to keep happening, and that teacher's going to leave. Yeah?
But I sort of say, does that block care also sort of extend to sort of like us as clinicians and that at times too, because I can feel that sometimes with my own stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's, we often talk about that in terms of like, vicarious trauma. Right? That's another phrase that we use to describe that. But I actually like whilst the term blocked care is a bit strong, it really does describe what you're experiencing, which is you care. You want to care, but you can't. Your brain won't let you. And if you don't take a break, you'll be terrible at it. And if you have the luxury of being a clinician who can take a break, then that's great. But if you're a parent, or if you're a teacher, a teacher should have a bit more capacity because there should be a system that cares for them. Whereas as a parent, you're it. And that's where the mental health system's role kicks in, is how do we lift some load off parents so that their blocked care can be healed. so that they're more able to be playful, they're more able to connect. Because the child will see that straight away. And block care is really good at pushing kids into shame. Right? Because the child's equivalent is what we call block trust. Like the child no longer trusts that you actually, like you say that you love me and you say that you're always going to be there for me, but I'm not sure I trust it anymore. Okay? So if possible, right, it is possible to reflect with teachers about the relationship without blame, without telling the teachers that you're doing something wrong. Because it's about the relationship between the teacher and the child. There's two people, there's two beings there. And and the usefulness of something like this, a reflective tool and a reflective process, is that it helps you focus on the fact that, hey, it's not your fault. It's also not the child's fault, right? Because what happens is if you've got a teacher with block care and a child with block trust, well, how's that going to end? Defensiveness breeds more defensiveness. You're never going to meet in the middle. You're like two magnets that just will never ever come together, right? Until something else breaks. And so so the TRI is quite a useful process. It talks about, it's a way that it goes through a couple of prompts where you describe the interaction. The teacher reflects on how they felt, and then also ask them to reflect on what the child may have been feeling at the time. And then also thinking about this really important prompt that says, what does this child activate in you that the others don't? Right? And without blame, right? And with sensitivity. And that's critical because it shifts the narrative from this child's difficult to something about them triggers something for me. Right? And I need to be aware of it. And that's how you prevent burnout. If you actually do something to support that. Okay, so it helps the teacher think about mentalize the child, which asks the question like, what might they have been expecting from me in that moment? What were they hoping I might say? Right? Because again, you're now starting to wonder, you're now starting to mentalize, which is really, really difficult to do if you've got blocked care. And if the child doesn't want to connect with you, if the child's rejecting your attempts to connect, that's not because you're failing as a teacher. It's because they've carried things with them before they walked in the classroom, and it's a shift in that attitude. So, if you ever get an opportunity to think, to build connection with a teacher, this might be a tool that you might think about.
I was just thinking about how you said, blocked care can lead to shame in that child, but I'm just thinking also about the clinician, the teacher, and not maybe responding in the right way, their own shame that comes from that, and it kind of keeps continuing in the cycle as well.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Classically, the parent who hears their mother's voice in the back of their head that says, "You're always going to fail." And obviously, mother's voice is just an example, but it's a common thought. Right? Obviously, it could be their dad or someone else, or just a core belief, and then the teacher loses control of their logic, and that's not going to be a great situation. And then at a deep, at a higher level, you can also think about, the attachment styles, right? So there is a questionnaire called the Attachment Questionnaire for Children, the educator version. So in our setting, we've talked about attachment styles. So remember that, so in the school setting, a child who is securely attached will trust adults, will make mistakes, but will bounce back, will respond to correction, will respond to advice because they trust adults. So a securely attached child at home will transfer their attachment to the teacher. Right? So remember the whole sort of strange situation assessment that we've talked about in the past about how to assess attachment, that because you trust your parent, and if that parent trusts that person, then you can transfer that trust, which is really crucial, that there is enough relationship between teachers and parents to transfer that trust, right? And that in itself is a problem. Because other than the parent-teacher interviews, which is often seen by the child as the parent and the child talking about things that they haven't done well, right? It's not the most playful of environments, and I do know that there are definitely some schools who do that a bit better, who create it as a connecting exercise rather than an assessment of the child and my adults talking about whether I'm passing or failing. So that's what's needed. Insecure attachment is to transfer attachment from the parent to the teacher. So even if you're insecure, that's still needed. That's still needed. An avoidant attachment is a child who hides their distress, often appearing fine on the surface but struggling to express themselves. And this is, how often do we hear from parents that my child is masking at school? Right? My other word for masking is coping. Right? If you're saying to me that your child is masking, it means that they're struggling with something, and they don't have a secure enough attachment to express that to the school, to the teacher. And what often happens, they come home and let it all out on you. And remember that that's important for parents to remember as well. That can actually be a sign of safety. Right? That's where they can only express their emotions when they get home. Ambivalent attachments. So remember that these are children who don't trust that their caregiver is actually going to give them the care that they want. In fact, they're not sure what to do, and so they kind of have this push-pull or love-hate relationship with their attachment figure. So when they feel uncertain, they might at some point cling, but also at some point push. And they might, and this is a child who might not, this is a child that will often lead to the teacher walking on eggshells because they don't know what they're going to get. And disorganized attachment is, remember that that's a more severe form of attachment disorder where you move into that shame phase really quickly. If there's any change or any perceived threat to the relational safety, you might collapse or you might fight, especially if you feel trapped, right? And you don't know what's going to happen, right? Whether they're activating their collapse response or they're activating their fight response. And that's also another one where it's probably the hardest for staff, because often the behaviour can be contradictory. Right? That you're trying. This is a child. Even also to some degree, the ambivalent child is that that you're trying to help them, but then they won't let you help, and they'll fight you. They'll fight your attempts to care, because they don't trust that people who say they care about them will actually lead to safety. So, if a child's secure, and if you're the usefulness of understanding attachment and a relational style of a child in a school setting is that you shift your conversation from, oh, he's just defiant, or he's manipulative. You stop labeling his personality to actually thinking about, hey, what's the pattern to this attachment figure? What's the pattern of this child's relationship to this teacher? Because every time there'll be one teacher who that child relates differently to. But what happens when we get reports? The child gets labelled as if it's the same for everyone, when we know it's not. It's never the same for everyone, right? But we think about, well, maybe he's actually avoidant because he hasn't had a predictable experience of adults being close to him. If your child's secure, then your job is to be consistent and not over intervene. Right? Promote autonomy, help them. And you might, this is a child who you will push to their own proximal development. You'll stress them. You might even stress them purposely a little bit, knowing that they'll cope, and you'll support them with that stress. If the child's avoiding you or not showing you, the initial instinct is to try harder. Right? I'm going to buy things for them. I'm going to do more things. I'm going to engage with them more. I refuse to let this child not engage with me, which can really overwhelm the child, and it can burn you out because you're actually trying the right things. But sometimes if the child's avoiding you you might actually push them further away. Right? And so what you do is the way you help an avoidant child is like rehoming an injured puppy. Right? Having a quiet, being close but not too close, being quiet and just showing that you're safe. Food helps with the puppy, and sometimes it helps with child as well, and letting the child know that you know them. Wondering aloud. I wonder if you're scared of this, or I wonder if you think that this is what's happening. You're not expecting a response, and a strategy in DDP that we use is talking about the child, where you might talk with another teacher. Oh, I think I'm wondering if Johnny's feeling a bit scared today because it's the start of school. So they kind of, even though you're not talking to them, they know that they're being thought of. You're giving them a voice, right? It's quite an important, it's quite a useful strategy. If they're ambivalent or disorganized, this is the times when you really need to kick in with routines, naming transitions, preparing for transitions, right? Reassuring them without reinforcing dependence. So that's a fine balance, right? And that's going to take trial and error, and that's going to take multiple people thinking about that child. And if the child's disorganized and shows you things that are a bit threatening or a bit scary, that's when your role is to the adult's job to stay regulated is most important. Because if the child can't regulate, then that highlights the importance of the adult needing to be regulated. And remember, if they're disorganized and they are dysregulated and they're into shame, you cannot solve that problem in that moment. So if you move into problem solving too quickly, you probably make it worse because they don't feel held. What they need to see is a regulated adult that says, we're going to be okay. You're really angry, you're throwing all of those things, but that's okay, we can clean all that up. Right? It's really important because, and so again, there are tools, there are things there are mechanisms that help us understand, a child's relational styles, right? And so it's important that we understand it. We understand if they're secure, they're avoidant. I don't know a school that actually thinks about their children like that, right? I don't know a school that says, all right, what do we do if a child is avoidant or ambivalent? What does gentle proximity and curiosity mean for that classroom, for that child? Right? How do we help one another to stay regulated and calm when a child is disorganized? So you can see that tiered approach, that need for the need for leadership to be able to guide it, because the teacher's the one who's in front. The teacher's the one in the coal face. Right? So it's really important. So for example, one of the things that, like just as an idea might be, like instead of an incident report that talks about what the child did and what were the antecedents, what were the consequences, what did we do? What if that report was a bit different? What if it's like, what happened? What did I notice in myself? What might the child have felt? What emotional need was communicated? What did I do next? And what could I have done differently to for example, the clear question there would be, did I stay in connection long enough? Or did I move to correction or problem solving or resolving the conflict in the child's mind too quickly? And we often do that because we need to teach. So I think that especially that an approach where we start to care about teachers, that they are emotional and feeling beings as well, right? And we prioritize that in our professional development. We prioritize that in our team approach. So hey, it's important to notice how you feel because one, you need to be cared for, and two, it's actually really important for your teaching. Right? So then, and hopefully if something like this becomes embedded in a school's culture, you then end up having all your team as well-being staff, not just the one well-being officer who's looking after 1,200 kids, and the school psychologist that pops in one day a week. to do therapy and fix these children. Right? And then, because what this will do is it will lead to stepped responses. Right? So, for example, this might be, we've talked about a safety plan in mental health parlance before, but and the principles are always the same. Check your own pulse, manage your own emotional state first. A dysregulated adult cannot regulate a child. That's the most powerful tool, is to have a regulated adult. Right? Minimizing shame can often be about reducing the audience, minimizing social pressure, reducing the number of observers. That's difficult to do. I've seen it done quite well, in a coordinated approach. I've seen a classroom that, if they couldn't move the child from the classroom space to another quieter space, then they had to move the other children out. And there was this kind of swift plan that got guys, let's help Johnny right now. Let's help him we're all going to go and do this activity, and I'll stay with him until he feels better. Right? But again, can you see the importance of the language so that it's not shaming? And then, the standard approaches. Name it to tame it. Right? Naming the feeling, not the behavior. Right? It signals safety. This is really hard for you right now. You're really struggling with this. You're really angry with us. And wait. Slow down to get there quicker. It's the hardest thing to do, because if you have blocked care and you're on edge, your frontal cortex isn't going to let you wait. You're going to want to protect yourself. You want to solve the problem, or you're going to need to protect yourself and actually, and try and defend yourself. You might activate your own fight response, which is really, really hard. Anytime there is a rupture in a relationship, it's always the adult's job to repair and reconnect before you can correct. So don't jump into what could we have done better. Remember, it's a neurobiological thing. This isn't a choice. This isn't just a philosophy. The science is really clear. If that brain hasn't come back to its close enough to its regulated state, you're going to push it worse. And then the adult takes responsibility to rebuild the relationship and trust after any incident. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Your dad's here to pick you up now, but I really want to see you tomorrow. I can't wait. I've saved your piece of work. I'm gonna put it up on the shelf, and when you come back tomorrow, we can finish it. That this incident hasn't led to this complete disconnection. We still want you, because I'm going to argue that might actually be a really, really important step to helping kids come back to school. And might be, that the sense of shame is probably more important than we think in terms of its contribution to school avoidance. Yeah? And our role as the clinical bridge is to provide that guidance, right? To reframe things, to reframe the narrative from this child is a problem to something is making your relationship stuck, right? There's a gap between the trust systems of the school and the teachers and the child's trust. That's the actual real challenge. Offer a formulation, not just a diagnosis. Right? And a formulation is something that teachers can do something more about. If you just say, oh, it's ADHD, teachers go, well, there's nothing we can do about that. They can't come back until they're medicated then. Whereas if you frame it as a story and a narrative, they can do something about that. They can understand the child. Oh, maybe there are things we can do to help this child feel safer. Always talk about the relationship, not just the child. And always think about what's happening at home. Right? The relational world from that child doesn't stop at the school gate. In fact, it's probably things happening outside the school gate that's spilling into the school gate. And always talk about how do the teachers get supported here? How do the teachers get support in terms of their regulation? and being okay. Can we offer something to you? Can we offer some consultation to say, hey, it's okay for you to say, hey, that child really triggers me. And it's okay to understand that. Like that, removing that sense of failure from the teacher will actually be a really good way to prevent burnout. So to summarize, right, that behavior makes sense always. Right? The number of times we say, I don't know why he does that. Well, it's because we probably haven't asked the right questions to understand where that child's coming from. There are always emotional drivers to behaviors. Behavior is always able to be understood when you think about the emotions behind the behavior, the emotional need, the relational need. And the relationship is the unit of assessment. That's what you need to think about, not the child. And this is a really big shift, because children get referred for assessment, not the relationship, not the blend, not the space between. And that connection before correction is neurobiology. That's not just a philosophical approach. It's not a therapeutic approach. That's just how brains work.